In the early 1900s, Paris was the shining heart of the world, the city of light, a glowing beacon of art, culture, and progress. But just beneath the surface, a different kind of show was pulling in millions of people. It wasn't a new masterpiece at the Louvre, or some shiny new technological marvel. It was a zoo. A human zoo. This is the story of something brutal, something many of us have forgotten: how men, women, and children were put in cages and displayed for entertainment. It's the story of entire villages recreated in the middle of Europe, where people were forced to perform their lives for gawking crowds. And it's the story of the twisted, racist ideas that made it all happen, ideas that were celebrated, not condemned. Imagine this: you're strolling through a park in Paris, not too far from the center of the city. You pass these carefully built pavilions, made to look like they've been plucked from some faraway land. But they aren't just buildings, they're lived in. Behind fences and bamboo walls, you see people from Madagascar, Indochina, Sudan, Congo, Tunisia, and Morocco. They're wearing what Europeans decided was traditional clothing, which was often totally wrong for the chilly Parisian weather. And they're forced to perform staged rituals and daily chores, over and over again. This was the reality of the Jardin d'Agronomie Tropical, a colonial exhibition held in the woods near Paris in 1907. Just this one exhibition pulled in over 1 million visitors between May and October. And these weren't small, fringe events. We're talking about huge, government-approved spectacles. Between the 1870s and 1930s, it's estimated that well over 1 billion people visited these human exhibitions around the world. These displays, sometimes called ethnological expositions or Negro villages, were a main attraction at the Great World's Fairs. The 1889 Paris World's Fair, the very same one that gave us the Eiffel Tower, had a Negro village with 400 indigenous people, its main event, drawing an incredible 28 million visitors. The idea was to create a tour of the world in a day, where the French public could see the people from their massive empire up close. But the story they were sold was a carefully crafted lie. But why? Why would a society that prided itself on liberty, equality, and fraternity get behind something so profoundly dehumanizing? The answer really comes down to two powerful forces that define the era: colonialism and so-called scientific racism. First and foremost, these exhibitions were colonial propaganda machines. France, just like other European powers, was aggressively expanding its empire. The human zoos were a way to justify it. They pushed a story where the colonizers were heroes, bringing civilization to primitive people. The exhibits were a powerful way to show off the sheer scale of the French Empire and get the public on board with the colonial mission. It was about demonstrating the power of the West by turning human beings into living trophies. This was all built on the horrifying foundation of scientific racism. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, this twisted pseudoscience tried to rank all of humanity on a racial ladder. European scientists used junk science, like measuring skulls, to argue that white Europeans were at the top of human evolution. Colonized peoples were placed on the lower rungs, often described as being somewhere between apes and civilized man. These zoos were the living, breathing proof of this ideology. People on display were often labeled with signs pointing out their supposed savagery. Maybe the most infamous case happened in America. A Congolese man named Benga was displayed in the Monkey House at the Bronx Zoo in 1906, right alongside an orangutan. The sign on his enclosure reportedly called him the missing link. And that wasn't a one-off mistake. It was the entire point. The exhibitions were designed to make racist theories look like fact, and to make the subjugation of millions of people seem natural and right. Behind the propaganda and the pseudoscience, there was a staggering human cost. These weren't just props in a display. They were people, with families and homes they were ripped away from. Recruiters often used deception, promising good pay or exciting travel, only to trap people in exploitative contracts. Life inside the enclosures was a nightmare. They were forced to live behind fences, stared at by millions of strangers who would often laugh, yell, and throw things like money or food at them. One journalist in Belgium described how crowds would toss bananas if the people weren't performing on cue. They had no privacy, no dignity, no humanity. The physical toll was brutal. They shivered in the cold, forced to wear thin, authentic outfits that were no match for a European winter. They were exposed to diseases their bodies had never encountered: smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, and many died, far from home. At a colonial exhibit in Belgium in 1897, 7 of the 267 Congolese people who were brought over died from pneumonia and influenza and were buried in a mass grave. The story of Saartjie Baartman, though it happened before this particular era, is a chilling preview. A South African woman exhibited across Europe in the early 1800s. She was paraded and objectified for her body. After she died, her ordeal wasn't over. Her body was dissected, and her remains were kept on display in a Paris museum until 1974. It wasn't until 2002, after years of requests from the South African government, that her remains were finally returned to her home to be buried. Her story, and thousands of others, show the deep cruelty at the heart of these shows, a cruelty that saw human beings as objects to be used, displayed, and thrown away. And while Paris was a major hub for this, it was far from just a French problem. This was a global shame. Human zoos were a popular draw across the Western world at the height of imperialism. You could find them in London, Brussels, Hamburg, New York, and even Oslo. Germany's Karl Hagenbeck, an animal trader, was a pioneer of these ethnological exhibitions, putting on shows with Sami and Samoan people in the 1870s. In 1896, the Cincinnati Zoo in the U.S. paid 100 Sioux Native Americans to set up a village on its grounds, and at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, over 1,000 Filipinos were housed in a 47-acre exhibit to show off America's new colonial territory. These exhibitions were most popular between the 1870s and the 1930s, a time when colonial empires were at their peak and their racist ideas were at their most shameless. The practice was so common that it became an expected part of any big international fair. This wasn't the work of a few rogue showmen. It was a deeply ingrained part of Western culture, reflecting a racism that stretched across nations and continents. The era of human zoos didn't just end overnight. It slowly faded as the world began to change. But it's shocking to learn that the last major human zoo was held at the 1958 World's Fair in Brussels. There, in a Congolese village, black men, women, and children were still being displayed for the amusement of white Europeans. Today, the physical sites are disappearing. The Jardin d'Agronomie Tropicale in Paris is now an overgrown, haunting park. Its decaying pavilions are ghostly reminders of a history ye would rather forget. For decades, the site was mostly hidden away, a stain on the nation's memory. But the real legacy isn't in crumbling buildings. It's in the persistent stereotypes and systemic racism they helped build. For decades, millions of Europeans and Americans had their views of non-Western people shaped by these degrading, cartoonish displays. These events didn't just reflect racist ideas. They mass-produced them and spread them, embedding prejudice deep into the public mind. Facing this history is a fairly new thing. It was only in 2011 that a major exhibition in Paris, called Human Zoos, The Invention of the Savage, tried to unpack this dark chapter for the public. It's a painful but vital process of admitting how the spectacle of the cage was used to justify the violence of the colony. So, the Human Zoo of the early 1900s wasn't some bizarre historical accident. It was the calculated product of an era drunk on imperial power and racial hierarchy. It was a propaganda tool that turned people into living exhibits to sell a lie, the lie of Western superiority. The fences and cages weren't just built with wood and iron. They were built with a dehumanizing ideology that infected an entire culture. Today, The physical cages are gone, but the work of dismantling the prejudices they helped build is nowhere near finished. Understanding this history isn't about getting stuck in the shame of the past. It's about seeing the deep roots of racism and making sure that no human being is ever put on display again. If this story opened your eyes, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more journeys into forgotten history. What are your thoughts on this dark chapter? Share them in the comments below. We believe that by shining a light on these stories, we can better understand our present